All right, let's begin. So dear students, colleagues, friends of Russian and East European cultures at Hunter, a series that brings the best of these cultures to Hunter College and to New York City, whether from Russia or Eastern Europe or locally from around the block, as you have probably seen. It's truly astonishing to see so many of you, and thank you for coming and talking. So today with us is Irina Prokhorova, a scholar, first of all, someone who hardly needs an introduction, but let me nevertheless say, a scholar, a publisher, a philanthropist, a media figure, the editor-in-chief of the New Literary Observer, which is, needless to say, by far the largest and the most important publishing house in Russia that specializes in the humanities. Since its inception in '92, it sustained a vital polyphony, I would call it, of scholarly and creative voices, including fiction, non-fiction, poetry, cultural history, criticism, as well as often first-time translations of Western scholarship and theory into the Russian language. So my Russian-speaking colleagues often refer to Ms. Prokhorov's publishing house as MVO by its acronym, which stands for the New Literary Observer or Новое литературное обозрение, but also happens to mean in the Russian language a UFO, неопознанный летающий объект. I'm just bringing this up to help you imagine for a moment what it meant for free-minded Russian, actually ex-Soviet scholars and writers to wake up one day in a completely different world. Maybe days, months, or actually a year after the fall of the Soviet Union, when, as you know, scholarship literature was state-run. So, and how fortunate along these lines we all are today that this MVO, a UFO operated by Irina Prokhorova, landed on this post-Soviet soil just in time, a touchdown that present-day Russian culture is very heavily indebted to. So in 2004, Irina Prokhorova co-founded the Mikhail Prokhorov Foundation, a charity organization that supports cultural initiatives in the Russian regions, but also promotes Russian culture worldwide. For example, through the Transcript Translation Project, which has acquainted so far numerous Russian writers with their readers abroad in foreign languages. Still more recently, Irina Prokhorova has personally supported numerous Russian writers, artists, scholars, filmmakers, journalists in their fight for the freedom of expression and for other civic values in Putin's Russia. She is a recipient of numerous Russian international prizes, including the Liberty Prize for contributions to the development of Russian-U.S. cultural relations, the Andrei Bely Prize for services to Russian literature, Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters of France, to name but a few. So let me just say how pleased and honored we are to be on your way. Thank you for being with us today and join me in welcoming Irina Prokhorova to Hunter.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, thank you for inviting me to this session. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here. While listening to all these words of me, I felt like I was being monument to myself, which sounds like arbitrary, you know. No, but I'm still a, well, moving target or a flying object in a way. My talk today will be, yes, of course, about Russia, about the situation of freedom and freedom of press. But, you know, I think that all the genres, you know, of a Russian person coming to talk about Russia has its own peculiarities. You know, I always noticed that people are expecting some very specific exotic horrors, speaking of some awful things going on in Russia. And interesting enough, when we're discussing with American friends what's going on in contemporary, present-day United States, present America, and they started complaining, we usually somehow filled with a strange pride and say, okay, you'll tell me we can tell you about, what we have, we can't compare the things. So I think in such cases, it's some mutual satisfaction, because the Russian side is feeling some pride about, surviving such awful conditions, being some kind of martyrs. And the American side thinking, okay, there are some places which are even worse than we have here. So this is sadomasochistic exchange of different values. I think it's a wonderful thing and quite traditional. But probably I'll try to find a little bit different way, just reflecting together with you about this really dramatic situation when somehow, we can find ourselves not only in Russia, not only in the United States, but probably in the present-day Europe in general. There are two books, one of which I've published recently, and the other I've managed to read, that produced a great impression on me. And both they are dealing with this problem of what's going on in the modern world. Why, in spite of so many achievements, of not only technological, but I would say many other sides of our life, we could see the appearance, the emerging or re-emerging of all kinds of populist figures, of this huge wave of traditionalism, xenophobia, which is sweeping the whole world. So the one book, and probably you know it better than me, it's by John Williams, White Working Class, Overcoming Class Cluelessness in America, which I think was quite popular and, well, quite influential in the United States. And I read it with great pleasure, and I was very much amazed that in spite of all the differences in our both countries, and historically, economically, and many other things, there are so many points which you describe, which can be applied to the Russian situation as well. And the other book, which I published myself, translated from Hungarian, is written by a Hungarian leading sociologist and political figure, Balint Magyar, which could be translated into English as The Anatomy of Post-Communist Mafiosi State, the Case of Hungary. And Magyar shows, as well as all kinds of researchers and many other things, showing that there is a strange paradox in the post-Soviet space describing Hungary, but again, if you change Hungary to Russia, you could see the picture clearly. So on the one hand, he shows that the society is not so much doomed by traditionalism. There are quite a lot of social discontent and so criticism of the present-day government. But strangely enough, so the democratic forces, which were so important in the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s, can't grasp this audience. So the paradox of that more than 60% of people are not satisfied with the present-day situation, political situation. But on the other hand, that so-called democratic opposition has very, I would say, small figures of real support, so 10 to 15%. So his idea that it's not because that the post-communist societies are not ready for freedom, by no means, but probably we could witness the crisis of political language. So this rhetoric, this discourse, which was so powerful in all Soviet and post-Soviet states in the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s, somehow is dismantled or discredited or somehow is worn out. So in this vacuum of ideas and concepts, the concepts of traditionalism, of traditional values are becoming very important. Not again because, at least as the author insists, that people just want to return to real Soviet situation, but somehow the project of future, the vision of future is closed. So in this way, probably if we look at the book by John Williams, she's speaking something the same, probably with different type of reflecting about the situation. But I think the results, the conclusions are the same. So this is the huge gap which exists between, as she calls it, professional elites, or probably educated stratas of society in contemporary America, and we can say in Russia as well, and the other social stratas, especially what she calls white working class, or that's, you know, as we call it in Russia, probably the middle class as well. So that we can see that in spite of all the differences, in a way we're all in the same boat. And this is the crisis, not of probably democratic or liberal values, but the crisis of political language, of expressing the things, is the most dangerous situation which we're looking for. You know, I remember in the early 90s when I went to Paris, there was a wonderful exhibition of the pre-war art. I mean, that's preceding the World War II, of course, in a way. And I had a very strange feeling. So on the one hand, there were all kinds of video and visual materials dealing with these crowds of young people cheering and celebrating Hitler coming into power. On the other side, you could see quite a lot of pictures, paintings dealing with, you know, with dismembered bodies. You know, in a way it was a feeling that somehow the art just felt that's the catastrophe going on. But my feeling was that the major tragedy of this period was the same thing probably we're witnessing now. This is the lack of arguments, the lack of influential rhetoric, which could be juxtaposed to this rising fascism and this infatuation with the totalitarian ideas, which the Europe, to which the Europe succumbed in the 30s. So I hate these parallels, historical parallels, but in a way, we are in the same position to some extent. We could see all these populist leaders with sometimes even with semi-fascist rhetoric, as it is in Hungary, and to some extent in Russia nowadays, reappearing and having quite a lot of more and more supporters among the people. So, in a way, what we can say and conclude to some extent, that perhaps only the disaster of the World War II stopped for some time this I would say stopped the effectiveness of this, I would say, propaganda of totalitarian, authoritarian ideas. So several generations who have witnessed the war and knew about that hated, you know, all this hate speech, hated all these enigmatic leaders in a way. So for many, I would say 2 or 3 generations prefer to have some bureaucrats and technocrats of power without all kinds of, you know, great narratives in a way. But we should understand this is a generational gap. So now we can see that at last 2 generations just never experienced the war. And somehow we could see that so not knowing what really war was reproduces the same idea of this clinging to this, to this, I would say, authoritarian rhetoric. It means that probably the remedy has never been found. So in a way, when I'm saying that we're all in the same boat, I would say that probably it's not the Russian case only, but probably the case of all intellectuals all around the world, to find this pure rhetorics, justification or legitimizing of democratic values. I could tell something about the Russian case, not risking to deal with the American one, but what happened, what is happening in Russia today? To some extent, a number of mistakes and illusions, probably delusions, starting from the early 1990s. You know, those who lived in the Soviet Union, there's some people, could remember about this total domination of ideology, I remember my generation was sick and tired of all these rhetorics, of all these imageries of the Soviet grandeur, which were burning away at the moment and becoming less and less attractive to my generation. So when 1991 came and the collapse of the Soviet Union occurred, I remember it was this very strong feeling of relief that now we can deal without any propaganda. And I know there were some memoirs of people who were close to Yeltsin at this time. And when in the mid-1990s, some people started talking that we need, not propaganda of course, but we need some talk about these new values, about moral values, about just explaining people what's going on, why the new idea of Russian Federation, of democratic values is so important, because people somehow disoriented. At least that people say that Yeltsin said, oh no propaganda at all. Let's live without it. Yeah, it's understandable. This is the trauma of this old, penetrating propaganda was very strong. But that was a fatal mistake, because during 1 or 2 decades, people were not explained what was going on, why they should suffer again, why it was the collapse of the Soviet Union, why all this Stalinist awful time was a time as a criminal. There are quite a lot of publications during the perestroika, but after the 1991, everything stopped. So that was, again, vacuum of ideas. People didn't know what, they survived, first of all, in a way. But we should not, we didn't realize that probably both Russian and American societies are still deeply religious ones. I mean, if you look at the Soviet Union, though officially it was so-called atheistic country, in a way, the communism ideology was a quasi-religious doctrine. So, in a way, that was society deeply influenced, but I would say system of values. Whether it was humane or inhuman, this is the other. But somehow the society was always ready to endure quite a lot of hardships, if at least, it was either for bright future or for their children or some moral values in it. So this, I would say, carnival of the 90s with its, I would pronounce the word which I hate, but probably with this immoralism to some extent, which was considered at the time as a kind of relief from the propaganda. It was very fruitful for us, I mean, intellectuals who could do quite a lot of many things. But probably it was quite harmful for the majority of people who really couldn't understand what's going on. Because on the television, we could see quite a lot of things which you couldn't imagine, even in the former times. For instance, I remember that one of the programs which was devoted to these Gulag problematics, which I think is one of the most traumatic and the most dark stories, side of the Russian history. And I switched on the television, which was marvelous in a way, because we have so many different channels with different views. And the 90s was the golden age of Russian journalism. It's absolutely true. Probably that was the most free country in the world concerning journalism, because the state was too weak to govern it. And there were new rich people who could invest in the journalism in a way. But when I looked at this program, I was absolutely horrified, because there was a moderator who was speaking with 2 people. One was the former Gulag survivor, and the other was the former Gulag guardian, So that was an attempt for discussion. I think it was something unimaginable, and I discussed with my friends and saying, so how could it be? How could it be that way? Is it a topic for discussion? There certainly should be some basis when there is no discussion at all. That fundamental values, that Gulag is awful. So how you can ask, Guardian, the former rather than saying, what do you think about it, whether it was needed or not. So in such, and when I discussed it with the journalists, my friends, they said, oh my God, you know, those who is bright will understand, and those who is fool, you will never explain it to anyone. So in a way, that showed a very peculiar situation. Though we were speaking about democracy for so many times in the 90s, it's occurred that in reality, the society was was not democratic at all. So, in a way, if you look at the Soviet situation and post-Soviet situation, if you say in reality, and of course, the Soviet Union always proclaimed égalitaire, fraternité, all other things, you know, the slogans of French Revolution. But in reality, it was very rigid, traditional society, where it was so-called General Secretary of the Communist Party as a kind of pseudo-emperor. It was elites, or a number of stratas who competed with each other for being an elite, a kind of nobility. And it was so-called the masses, or that folk, as we said, in a way, who were looked at as a kind, not the real agents of history, but somebody who would be patronized. So, of course, we never pronounced such thing and never thought about it. But I could give you one example from a very well-known playwright and a writer of the older generation, who wrote memoirs about his youth in the late 40s, 1940s. So that was the end of the 40s, one of the most dramatic times in Russia, with this new wave of purges, and that's the agony of the Stalinist regime. But he was young and ambitious, and he came, it was Leonid Zorin, who is still alive. So he came to Moscow as a young man, and so he went to the Bolshoi theater, to one of these ballets, operas, I don't remember at the moment. So, but after the event, he was standing at the end of the big staircase, looking at the people coming. And what he was describing, that's what quite a lot of people in military form, with medals, you know, all their breasts with medals, their ladies in long dresses with furs on their shoulders, and they were coming down. So he was writing, I could see that a new Russian nobility was emerging, which was true. So I would say, if you look at all these inner struggles in the Soviet society, so it was Russian intelligentsia who competed for being at least intellectual elite. Don't cough. So there's a military stratas, KGB stratas, who were all pretended to be not as part of the society, but really true nobility. So I'm afraid this tradition just stayed in the 90s as well, where these educated classes, I would say professional elites in a way, still looked at themselves as being part of a privileged strata in a way. So it produced quite a lot of pleasant results and consequences. And as I said, that the idea of discussed very important moral issues and moral values had never been really put into the agenda. So the idea that people somehow were not ready for freedom, or they should be patronized, somehow stayed in the society, which never has been pronounced openly, but somehow now we can see that it was the case. In a way, just not respecting that's the real situation where people lived. You know, just what I'm saying, it's more self-criticism than criticize someone else. Of course, I stem from the same snobbish part of the society, but I had to change quite a lot of my views about it. When especially I started my publishing business, and you need to look at the society much closer if you publish the book you want to distribute them to more people, to the more people, and especially when my brother and I started the foundation. which is supporting Russian culture. You know, all these accuses of people saying that then they don't understand contemporary art, that they're too traditional or too xenophobic, sometimes stem from this huge gap between the cultural background of one part of the society and the other one. You know, when we start working, and we start working in the Krasnoyarsk area, this is the Central Siberia. So at first, of course, we were so much ambitious, saying, okay, we'll support the best project, while, you know, we'll just create something very contemporary there. But somehow we faced the situation that people really had never free access to contemporary culture. They lived in the very traditional surroundings, in industrial, ugly cities. Somehow, I myself, I started understanding something about contemporary art when I first came to New York, with contemporary architecture, with these great museums of contemporary art, you know, just seeing the background, the context in a way. So, should we expect from people who could never see and study contemporary culture, should we expect that they will support us immediately? So quite a lot of scandals that occurred during this period. Well, it doesn't justify nowadays our state who is trying to purge, you know, and persecute contemporary artists. I'll tell probably a few things about it later. But still, you know, could we accuse people of being ignorant if they really didn't have chance to learn it? So when we started working and analyzing the local community, we realized that it's useless to bring something provocative because people will react as a humiliation. So instead of, you know, presenting something, you know, trendy, in a way we started, you know, a kind of anthropological study. So what is historical, economical, social situation in the regions? What type of culture they have, what they used to, what's their really problems. So we started going step by step, you know, if we produce something new, we somehow made some lectures, seminars, explaining the things. We brought some traditional art, culture, but of a very high quality. So going step by step, in 3 years, people could see and appreciate the most radical art, even more radical than it was in Moscow. But it means that somehow people are adapting very, very quickly. But in a way, this situation taught us a very important lesson, that probably we underestimate the society and we can't find this language talking about very important things. So in a way, if we look at this huge wave of traditionalism, which is Russia now, and it's becoming really a part of open process, the political process in many ways. Probably you know that the case of Kirill Serebrennikov, who is the leading theatrical person, he's theater director and producer. Now he's accused of embezzlement, which is absolutely nothing to do with reality. And so it's interesting that now it's not only money which is incriminating him, but now we are just... so there was a publication in one of the newspapers just recently that a number of leading theater figures were not invited to the cultural forum, annual cultural forum in St. Petersburg. So that was the best cultural figures in a way. But that was an inner letter from the Minister of Culture that somehow, you know, got into the press. And there was an interesting, how to say it, explanation why. Because these people, you know, with all their plays and many other experiments, they were dissolving or blurring, I don't know how to say it in English, the spiritual, moral traditions of the Russian culture, something like that. It sounds even more awful in Russian, in a way. And it shows, I would say that the average educational level of people who are producing such papers. But in a way, unfortunately, they're not coming from Venus or Mars or some other planet in a way. They are part of our society and the majority of the society. So, in a way, the problem we're facing now, really, and I'm quite sure that in contemporary Russia there are quite a lot of discontent, and we know quite a lot of protests against the situation. But the probably really, again, what is the new language of this era? When I'm calling political language, it's not only logos, slogans somewhere, but, this understanding, that specularity of the society, how it reacts to different issues and in what way. By the way, it's an interesting case, for instance, that, as probably you know, that for the last 3 centuries at least, because the political sphere practically has never existed in Russia, it was always usurped by the state in a way. So all political and social issues were discussed in the realm of literature and culture. It's a well-known fact. But then we could think about it. Probably this new political language, at least in Russia, could be reformulated through the lens of culture. Why not, in a way? So this is the problem, of inventiveness or creativeness, I would say. And I noticed quite a lot of time, if you talk, and participate in many book fairs, in a way, in Russia. So if you discuss these burning social issues, discussing the book or dealing with some cultural issues, people understand you and appreciate you just enormously. But if you switch into this, I would say, worn-out political rhetorics, you'll immediately, get this aggressive response. So in a way, probably we're facing a challenge. I mean, intellectuals. So do we know our own society? Do we know the potential of the society? Do we just can't imagine how people react? What is the tradition, I would say, of freedom in Russia, which does exist? I don't believe in the situation that people are not ready for freedom. And we could see that in the 90s, people, in 1991, people came to the barricades. I was among them. I could see that all social strata is going to it. So, but how it's expressed, how people understand what is freedom in a way, that's another case. So, again, I don't risk, just addressing the American situation, but I could see many things going on in Europe. Well, in post-communist countries, I would say the situation is only the same as in Russia. It's easier to talk to East European intellectuals. So, in a way, I would say that the problems which Russia facing, and probably in other countries, is reformulating the idea of democracy and freedom and liberal values. So this is the war of values, not of economies. I'm quite sure of it. And probably it's high time, instead of, expressing this national points of view. It's always a comfortable situation when you come to some country. You're looked at as an official representative of the state. And either you have to say, no, I have nothing to do with that, or this is an instinct to defend even the most unpleasant things, because somehow you don't know where you are in a way. But if you are intellectuals, it means that we're not only criticizing, but creating new ideas. In a way, probably it's high time to make this horizontal ties. Again, just to discuss it, because that's our, I would say, mutual problem in a way. What to deal in the world which is changing so rapidly, where people are reacting in such a dramatic way. And we shouldn't forget these democratic ideas. Well, it was the 17th and the 18th century. That was a powerful ideological tool. And somehow it's conquered the majority of people. So in a way, and we know that there were brilliant philosophers and intellectuals who started this process. At first, these ideas were emerged in the handful, among that, 10 or 15 people all around Europe, but then became so influential ideas. So in a way, probably we should start anew just refining this new language and justifying our views and ideas, and probably reevaluating the society itself. So on the one hand, of course, this is a very dramatic and unpleasant moment, but the crisis is not only the end, but the beginning of something new. So we're at the beginning of a new stage, of a new period of time. And it makes me more or less optimistic, in spite of all the, I would say, dramatic things which are going on in my country. Let me stop here, and probably you'll ask me some questions. I don't know whether it was intelligent or it was interesting for you. So the questions will help me, to explain the things that probably I couldn't explain properly.
If I may take this opportunity to ask just the first question, please forgive me, but I can't possibly hold it back. My question is to follow up on what you have been saying, namely that, of course, history does not, as we know, tolerate the subjunctive mood. It does not tolerate the would, what would be, what if. On the other hand,
there is a new intellectual trend, academic trend, which insists it is possible to say. To start a history in this mood.
This is what has been said. But it does reveal a certain cyclicity. And if we're talking about the 90s and the present day situation, my question is, what is that which literature, which in Russia has always been modern literature, as again this folk wisdom goes, what is it that, in your opinion, it should be, not should be, but is it doing something today, contemporary, present-day Russian literature, of the sort that writers in the 90s, and in particular, I mean, forgive me for such a long flashback, but I do mean Solzhenitsyn, who just came back from exile to Russia in '94. So, is there something that you could compare the 90s in the 90s and the present day as this moment on the eve of a new period, the end of the crisis, the beginning of the end of the beginning, and in particular, where what is Ivan Denisovich Shukhov doing today? Where is he?
Oh my God!
Sorry.
That's interesting how this all perceptions of Russian cultural field are still, of course, literature in the Soviet Union was the major intellectual force. But nowadays, I think, in a way, that we share with the whole world, that literature is one of the fields of intellectual life, but not the major one. And we can't compare the situation of contemporary Russian writers with Solzhenitsyn or Shalamov, or these great writers of the Soviet Union did. And nowadays, probably, if we look at the cultural sphere, I would say the contemporary theater and contemporary art is much more influential than literature really is. It doesn't mean that the people stopped reading, but they stopped reading the same books. I would say in the Soviet Union you could differentiate whether it's your milieu or not, whether it's just according to the quotation that people did, whether you can deal with a certain person that's meant with tell me what you are reading, I'll tell me who you are. Nowadays, it's not the situation at all. And I would say it's an interesting case because this old identity, cultural, ideological, political identity, which somehow got through the lens of reading, does not exist. And in a way, this is always the question, through what means, I would say, the younger generation is identifying itself. I ask questions to young people somehow. So what are the means? What are the, and they couldn't tell me. Probably what we're going to witness is a kind of misplaced identity, so to say, in contemporary Russia. And that's why probably the state tries to create this as a utopian, notorious vision of the great empire which existed forever, of a specific spirituality of Russian people in a way. It sounds ridiculous to us, but at least this is an attempt to create this post-Soviet identification. The mere word post-Soviet means that we don't have positive identity in a way. Post-Soviet, post-communism shows this, the feeling of lost collective individual identity in a way. And that's one of the problems why I would say Putin's propaganda is more or less effective. Not so great, but still. So you need something, who you are, where, what you're part of, what society in a way. So I would say if you look at the contemporary Russian literature, there are a variety of brilliant writers. By the way, poetry is very popular now. But I'm sure that you will never find that's a prophet there. It's a different age. It's a different period. And probably if these new prophets or opinion leaders will appear, I don't know whether they will stem from literary world. They could be from religious, anywhere, but we don't know. I would say literature, in a way, became a private leisure. People read different. That's why there is illusion people stopped reading. They didn't stop. But they don't read one thing, and cherishing this secret text.
Thank you so much.
Hello. Yeah, 2 days ago, I went to the book presentation of Mikhail Ziger, and he said that Kirill Serebrennikov was arrested because he is like Khodorkovsky, but for cultural people. So he compared him with him, and I couldn't help but wonder, like, why him? Like, why not Zvagintsev or maybe some other influential theater figures? Can you give me some thoughts on that, please?
I think it's a matter of chance. In a way, if you start this so-called terror machine, it's a matter of chance who will be the next victim. Because in a way, this machine is blind. It needs fueling all the time. But it could be different cases. Somebody denounced him, or it was some enemy, that he didn't like Serebrennikov. I don't know. It doesn't matter in a way. What matters? How the whole process is going on. It's fabricated, because I was participating in these 2 sessions when prosecutors were presenting the case. It was absolutely, the lawyers, showed all the evidence that there is no embezzlement and nothing there. It doesn't matter in this way. So they're trying to create this open process, harassing the people in culture, something like that. Whether they succeed or not, we don't know. But the situation is really quite tragic. But, just trying to find, some inner reasons why he and not the other, it's no use. It's a different logic.
Irina. This is probably a terminological confusion, but when I came to this country many years ago in '79, I was perhaps at that time unpleasantly surprised, but now I would say that I was pleasantly surprised that intellectuals and educated class would never speak about themselves as an elite. While I think that...
but John Williams, interesting enough, she uses the word. Probably this is a new situation. Sorry to interrupt.
It is absolutely interesting because we live now in the political environment where we kind of feel that we would rather have a political elite and intellectual elite to confront reality. But do you think that, because I also I'm trying to speak with younger people a lot, and it seems to me that they do not use that anymore. intelligentsia,
No.
intellectual elite. This kind of dissolved in the post-Soviet reality as it probably dissolved everywhere.
Yes, this is a good question. Yes, the word intelligentsia is an old-fashioned. Or sometimes the young people call their parents in such a way. They were intelligentsia and they're intellectuals or something, in a way. I remember that the last discussion about intellectuals and new intelligentsia was in 2011 and 12 after this protest movements. So they're trying to find this, how to define this new generation of protesters who are usually people from the so-called educated professions, so to say. And of course, this is quite a lot of confusion. As I say, this is a kind of confused identity. It means that, strangely enough, we still don't know the social stratification of our own society. So what are social strata or classes, how you can define in a way. And that's, I think, the major problem which we're facing. But I wanted to add that speaking about these moral values, so to say, that's how, so the case with Kirill Serebrennikov and some others are just going on. It's not, it's useless to say why they're doing that. I mean, they're trying to harass, and it's quite understandable. But how? And why it's very difficult to oppose them? It started in the late 90s and beginning 2000s, where somehow this, I'd say, democratic part of society was presented as immoralists. So without values, they don't believe in God, they are humiliating believers, many other things. And at first, somehow we were too nonchalant. We didn't realize this is a danger. So in a way, it means the state, the conservative part of the society, usurped all moral values and were left without counter-arguments. You can't say, no, we have a constitution that we may be not believers, it's according to constitution. No, but no pay attention to constitution in our country. It exists by itself, and the living practices, by themselves. So in a way, all old forms of justification, which were very effective in the 70s, in the 80s, appealing to great writers, to, some other things, don't work at all. So in a way, somehow, we have thrown all our gods into the rivers, and now we just don't have the, I would say, authorities, symbolic authorities to play with. So this is the problem, appealing to justice or something like that doesn't produce any effect in the society. So in a way, that's why when I started several years ago my TV program, I called it System of Values. We started discussing the things. Somehow this misinterpretation of many things in a way. How you can differentiate between false values and the true ones. So many difficult questions occurred suddenly. And we have no answer to all.
There was a question.
I have a question about traditionalism. One could say that traditionalism is passé in terms of being a constructive agenda. But at the same time, I'd argue that you cannot really call people like Putin or Trump traditionalists. Because one,
number of names you can use, of course. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think that I'd argue that this, if you look at what they're doing, for instance, I would argue that the problem is that the labels we now use are much displaced, and I think that the common people may be much disoriented when it comes to these. I'm thinking of some figures who stand in a way in the middle, both in the United States and in Russia, and thinking of Russia because, well, that's the case we'd like to stick to. I'm thinking people who are liberal, but at the same time express a lot of, I'd call these conservative ideas. I'm thinking of people like Tatiana Tolstoya or Dmitry Bykov, for instance. Do you see them as allies in your cause, or rather as those who are, of course, not on the side of the government, but at the same time are not helping either? Thank you.
It's a good, very difficult questions. You know, I could call, I can't judge about Mr. Trump, you know, I can only speak about my own president in a way. I can call Mr. Putin a traditionalist or conservative thinker in a way. You know, I don't want to demonize him, of course I'm quite critical of him, but I can see what he's expressing, at least quite a lot of quite common things coming from the past. First of all, the idea that such a great country could be ruled only by force and super concentration in a way. It's a long tradition, by the way, of the Russian Empire, nothing new in it. So the idea that it could be not, that it could be a federation but not empire, this is still, I think, is not very popular among people, you know, including Mr. Putin. We can discuss quite a lot about the things, but I know quite a lot of intellectuals with whom I'm friendly who support this idea that we need this super centralization. So otherwise the country will fall apart. I don't believe it, I think on the contrary, but still this is the case. On the other hand, I could say, if you look at all these historical visions, now the fight for history which is going on, it's again the people, Mr. Putin, people around him, they're expressing quite a traditional view about the country as a great empire, in a way. With quite a lot of, you know, references to conservative thinkers, in a way. So if you want to argue about that, you need to do it. But at least Putin is my contemporary, well, the same generation. We read the same, and we had the same history textbooks at school, you know, where this idea of great empire, of course it was never pronounced empire, the Soviet Union, but still it was an empire, was presented as the only one model. So quite a lot of people, even if they criticize Mr. Putin, I think agree with this note. This is the problem for us. If we have the alternative vision of history, you know, that's the problem for intellectuals. You know, can we present this new historical vision, intellectual vision to the society? Otherwise, we'll repeatedly have the same old-fashioned ideas for political decisions. You know, and why not being allies with Tatiana Tolstoy and Dmitry Bykov? You know, that's my always reflections of the last century. What is the platform of the Union? You know, I would say the country is exhausted by this so-called cold civil war, which is still persisting in the society. And, you know, that's the state is manipulating with it. It's always creating this inner enemies, outer, you know, enemies, something in the way. This is again the old Soviet tradition, you know, just identifying and opposing to this, either class basis or this political basis. The question is whether we can find these common values and common platform with people who are of different political views, but we have much more in common in other things than political things. I think it's quite important. Otherwise, you know, it will be always clashes on the grounds which somehow probably are not our own.
Thank you. So speaking of history and publishing and Russians, Americans, perhaps even propaganda, many differences and opinions. Do you have any thoughts about Masha Gessen receiving the National Book Award this week?
Sorry, receiving?
She received the National Book Award this week, Masha Gessen.
Yes, okay, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
I can congratulate her.
Well, aside from the just really the book, I believe it's The Future is History. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I know Masha Gessen from the 90s and 2000s before she immigrated, so she came back to the United States. Well, I quite respect her. Well, we could disagree on some things in a way, but she's a brilliant journalist, and I'm quite happy for her.
Hi. Do you believe that there are any mistakes or anything that the West didn't do after the collapse of the Soviet Union that would have had a better result or a better future for Russia today?
Oh, it's, I would say, too philosophical question. Well, first of all, the West is something very, what is the West? You know, this, I'm afraid this is all the remnants of the Cold War rhetorics, you know, the West, the East. You know, the West is so different. In a way, I don't know, really. It's quite a wonderful opportunity to blame the West for everything, you know, which is what we're doing now inside Russia. At least, not me, of course, but you say that saying the West did the same, this way. Perhaps it was quite a lot of mistakes. We all made a lot of mistakes. But I'm much more interested in what we're doing inside Russia. How we're dealing with the situation, how we cope with reality. What were the interrelations between, you know, different European, non-European countries? So the West, or that's Russia in a way, it's wonderful inventions, you know, allowing just to get rid of any responsibility for what is done in the countries. I don't know. It could be some mistakes or good. Well, I'm personally very grateful, for instance, to Soros Foundation, which has saved Russian culture and education in the 90s. And it's not a metaphor, it's reality. Somehow, really, we should put a monument to him in Russia, and instead, you know, that was an open gratitude to him. But probably in future.
Soros.
Yes. Sorry for that.
He saved Russian science.
Irina, I want to ask you, you mentioned that for 300 years Russia actually lived under the totalitarian regime.
Oh,
I mean,
always
Tsarism,
authoritarian and totalitarian, yeah.
First it was Tsarism, the last 100 years was
Yeah.
70 years of Soviet power. In your mind, what makes you optimistic thinking that there will be a change? Why, after living like through Soviet years, Russian people didn't get immune to totalitarianism? Why there's still this way, the way they vote now? I know that 85% by statistics support. Again, I don't know how accurate. No, I know that during Soviet year 99% voted for Brezhnev. Right. I understand, maybe not 85, but still there is people in Russia. What can change the way they're thinking, the way they want to live in democratic society rather than in authoritarian, let's say it this way, not authoritarian, but authoritarian.
You know, I'm an optimist because being a publisher, you must be an optimist, especially dealing with academic literature. Just believing that somebody will read it and will need it in a way. You know, I never believed in this essentialism, I would say, that saying that Russia is always, you know, doomed to live in some, you know, authoritarian, totalitarian society. You know, that's unfortunately there is a lack of real debates about this centenary of the Russian Revolution, how it happened, how this tragedy occurred, why, what were the circumstances. But still, you know, just speaking about these authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, you could see the other side. It means that if everyone, you know, 99% or 85% support such type of state, why it should be so cruel in a way? If people, you know, love it, you don't need, you know, such suppression in a way. It means that there are quite a lot of different ideas and ways of life coexist and exist in the country. And because it's so huge, you know, so Alexander II, the emperor, I think said that our territory is our curse. You know, so that you could find so many different models of life and possibilities. That's saying that this centralization and authoritarian, you know, and monarchism, it's the only way of Russia. It's not. we could see in history quite a lot of different models and trends existing in society. I won't say that Russian people somehow don't understand, well, they can say that they don't need democrats in a way, but if you ask them about their strategy, personal lives in a way, it means that quite a lot of them just like lived in democratic society, especially if you speak about children and ask them about their prospects, how they describe it. So we're never using the words democracy or freedom. Somehow they express their ideas, you know, for safety, freedom, for their children in a way. Why it's so difficult just to achieve it? I think I think the real problem. It's in the authoritarian societies. There is no, of course, the tradition and training of association, you know, of this horizontal ties, of creating institutions, which some, you know, any initiatives which were not coming from above has never been, yes, appreciated in a way. They're always suppressed. But in the Soviet Union, you can't come into the streets and cry, "Long live the Soviet power!" You'll be arrested because it was not sanctioned. You know, you'd never express your patriotic feelings without asking permission. You know, not only being opposed to it. So I think what we really lacked in the 90s, besides many other things, you know, understanding the importance of these social institutions, that we should defend them. So I remember in the early 2000s, when one of the major TV channels, NTV, was closed and dispersed, you know, and that was the first real sign of what was, you know, what would be the fate of the independent media. So logically, you could imagine that that's all media, all channels, you know, all journalist world should stand for defenders. On the contrary, I remember that all started, suddenly speaking, this TV channel was not so good as, you know, as it was reputed. So that the leader of the channel had a very bad character. So there were quite a lot of things, you know, that somehow, you know, and there was quite a lot of rivalry between different TV channels. So anyway, why? Because there was no feeling and understanding that it doesn't matter whether you love this channel or its president or not. It's, you know, it's the system of institutions. You know, you should defend the freedom of media. You can quarrel inside, you kill each other somehow. But this is your profession. This is the institutions in a way. This could never be touched. You know, it seems very simple in a way. But strangely enough, to realize that you need quite a lot of time to create this new solution. And somehow we really didn't understand the importance of it. Now probably I could see that the younger people just understand it better. But still, I think this is the major problem with the society. But in many other cases, the society is very adaptive. I remember in the 90s when there was no state at all. You know, everything was in rules. So there is no no personal, no inner safety. That's you know, the whole social structure has collapsed. And when we started, you know, we had only you could only rely on yourself. And just within several years, the whole social world were established by the society. So there are quite a lot of potentials, but in a way, you know, you can't create a democratic society even in 20 years. It's impossible. We should be patient, probably, and more educated society ourselves, you know, just you need longer.
It's almost 30 already. It's almost 30 already.
So we probably have
So
time.
what? So what? Is it possible, do you think it's really possible to create an ideal democratic state after so many years? What is it? You know, that's utopian vision sometimes. You know, it's becoming the major hindrance to many positive changes. Because we want it immediately without realizing whether people, you know, understand that or are ready for many other more radical steps in a way. This is quite a question.
So we have time for two more last questions.
I'm too talkative.
And
My
the last
answers
one,
are so long, I'm sorry.
and the last one
Can
by
I
our.
speak without microphone? It's small room anyway. Can I speak in Russian, please?
It's better if you do it in
I'm
English.
sure majority speak Russian.
No, it's better if you do this in English.
I'll answer in English.
Okay,
if you don't mind.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you said post-Soviet and post-communistic country, right? That's what Russia is now. And I would say, even in my opinion, this post-Marxist country. Is there any philosophers, like beginning at least, political philosophers who try to analyze what is going on philosophically with communism, ideas, and deterioration, and распад, как сказать, total disintegration of idea of
What's the question?
Yes.
Thank you.
Is there any authors?
Well, that's an interesting situation. On the other hand, of course, the Marxist doctrine, I would say, in the Soviets, it's not Marxism, but I would say the Soviet version of Marxism, of course, has disintegrated. On the other hand, I would see there's a new generation of leftist thinkers, young people, who are very much interested in Marxism. But they are reading, of course, quite a lot of Western literature, trying to revelate the traditional Marxist thinking. Well, being a former Soviet person, of course, I'm very reluctant to appreciate in a way. But to some extent, I understand them. They're trying to find some remedy against the situation they're having. So this tradition about being buried by the official dome in a way somehow is reviving through the part of the society who are trying to speak about justice, solidarity, and many other things. And I said we don't have any other language besides the Marxist language in a way. So it's becoming a tool for many young intellectuals. Well, why not? Let it be.
Thank you. So the
Marxism should not let be.
The last two questions by our tradition should go to students.
My question is, do you believe that there is any danger in putting contemporary trends on a pedestal, and if that could create a utilitarian society, or a society where there is no room for traditional traditional thinking?
I didn't get what putting.
If putting contemporary trends, contemporary art, or trends that are contemporary, it seems as though maybe they're put on a pedestal. If that would create a utilitarian society.
Utilitarian meaning what?
In what sense? Utilitarian?
Just ruled by the philosophy of utilitarianism. If there is any connection.
Well, really, I don't know. I never thought about it. Thank you, I'll think it over. But I think it would be a constellation of different things. You can't put anything contemporary, traditional, pedestal. I think it's much more complicated. We can't rely on the contemporary art to make some contemporary trends. What is contemporary in many ways? This is the question. Do we think about some radical things, or reinterpretation of classical heritage that also could be contemporary? I think when I'm thinking about this crisis of rhetorics, I'm speaking quite a lot of notions. What is progress? What is contemporary? What is traditional? How we could measure all the things. I'm afraid there's quite a lot of confusion nowadays.
You say that Russia has sort of an imperfect democratic ideals as of yet because of the centralization of power with the president. In America, we have very decentralized power, meaning there are many branches that hold a lot of power with equal weight. Would you say that the ultimate evolution of Russia's democracy leans towards decentralizing power?
Unfortunately, not at the moment, but I think, of course, I would say if we want to develop in the democratic way, of course, we should decentralize power.
But don't you think that leads to other problems like what we have in America?
Well, I can't judge, so in your city you have your own problems, of course, but at least in 4 years or even 3 years, you could change your president. And find some other person who would express your ideas in a way. So I think that's a very important thing,
So would you say that the majority of the Russian people would like to see a new leader?
Well, I don't know, perhaps, but unfortunately you can't prove it because the political life is so shrinking, and it's nowadays practically impossible for independent candidates, to appear on political scene. It's quite dangerous and it's possible. So speaking about people who they like or not, it's no use because if you have this variety of candidates, then you can say and you can judge, what the majority of people are thinking. So in a way, this is a paradoxical situation because if you don't have the freedom of speech, if you can't, just find the true figures, what's going on, the society becomes the enigma to itself and to the state as well. And this is a very dangerous situation because if people don't protest, if they stop answering frankly to all the sociological surveys, and it's well-known fact that you can receive 90% of support to anything because people just stopped answering the questions. If you call a person on his or her mobile and his or her phone, home telephone, asking them what, do you support the president? In majority of cases they will say yes. Whether they really support or not, the people are cautious, to express their feelings. So in this way, I think the danger is that many political decisions and economic decisions are made based on these figures, which doesn't say anything about the society. By the way, that's one of the reasons why the Soviet Union has collapsed. Because I remember myself when I started working in the late 70s, the idea was, because we were competing with the capitalist West, so we needed to produce the figure of, growing GDP, that's growing economic progress. In reality, it was a crisis. So, but all institutions, every 3 or 4 months, produced false figures of achievements. And all these figures were analyzed, and all the economic programs were built on these falsified figures. As a result, that's somehow the state couldn't overcome the real crisis and has collapsed because it's really believed that we have this wonderful perspective and economic life. So that's the major, I would say, the loss of this independent press is probably more dangerous for the state itself than for society. That's my opinion.
I have the microphone here, finally. Спасибо большое, Irina. I'm here.
Oh,
I have a question. I don't need the microphone.
Okay, I'll answer 2 questions. I'll try to be short.
Yeah, no, I'm very short.
I'll try to be. My answer will be short. I'm sorry.
We were just talking about Marxism, and we all as good Marxists, aren't we putting, I understand that the intellectuals, of course, should be doing what they're always doing, like developing the language or the new language and the new notions. But aren't we putting the cart before the horse in the sense that with the failing economy and a big chunk of the population living beyond the poverty line, no matter what language you develop, they don't care. People care little about abstract notions if they have nothing to eat. So it's not denying that the intellectuals should be doing what they always are doing, but I have a problem with this sort of idea that the ideas can exist in this vacuum without the economical background.
Yes, of course, but as we know, not only from Russian history, being satiated is not enough in a way, and in many ways people can sacrifice quite a lot of material, well, for quite a lot of ideas. Well, I'm not, you know, I don't like the idea that you need to lose everything for something, either for freedom or I don't know what. But it's not a this is not direct correlation between, you know, the material prosperity and the ambitions of the people. You know, I will give you just one example how this, that's some kind of traditional values can influence people's identity. So we in the 90s, we had a very paradoxical situation. That's many people who were quite poor, just being teachers or engineers or doctors. That was the social strata which was so much important, but their salaries were miserable comparing to the working profession in a way. And in the 90s, they became quite prosperous. Some of them became very rich because of it. But they still believed and felt that their social status has fallen because they were teachers, they were engineers, and then they became just business people in a way. It shows the status of different professions. Well, nowadays, in a way, it's almost the same, strangely enough, because nowadays the propaganda, again, this discrediting that's people of action in business. But in the 90s, you know, business was promoted as a kind, but still the older generation of intellectuals still considered it was unfair that they couldn't stay being engineers, just receiving good money, but they had to go into business. So instead of praising themselves that they're so wonderful that they changed their situation for better, they lamented and being nostalgic about the Soviet time. So this has nothing to do with material. It's with system of values and ideas. You know, so it's quite a complicated case.
Oh, and the very last.
Yeah.
Thank you. My question is, you said that literature today doesn't really like play the same role as it did in the past. So I wanted to ask you, what about the role of the internet? Does it have an impact on Russian political life and not just political, but on you know, social and arts, but especially particularly political life? What effect does the internet have? And is like in Russia, do the people watch YouTube? Do they make their own documentaries? Because I heard about bloggers being arrested, you know, and things like that. But still, like, does the internet have an effect on Russian politics?
Oh yes, very much. I would say it has a great impact on Russian life, you know, and intellectual and social and political life. And I would say Russia was one of the first countries who I would say used internet quite successfully and much better than I'd say many European countries. I think, interesting enough, it's part of the Soviet heritage with this parallel underground culture, somehow which was possible to create this independent space for cultural and social issues. So, of course, internet is one of the major forces in Russian life. It's really true. And in many ways, you can find quite a lot of information there, in spite of all the censorship anyway. So now the state is trying to control internet, but still, it's impossible. You know? It's a great thing.
Well, on this note, on this optimistic note, we should probably conclude, and let's thank Irina Prokhorova.